Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. I've been fortunate enough to watch the full episode in Season 3, Episode 1 of True Confessions. It's a 1 hour, 6 minute and 5 second episode, and what I'm going to be doing here is going through 5 segments dealing with 10 to 15 minutes at a time of the particular episode. I would really have liked to have kicked off with the shadows on the driveway segment, but let's do this in chronological order, starting with the phone narrative. Here and there I'm also going to be taking you through some True Crime Rocket Science insights, just a couple of things that I noticed that maybe you have, maybe you haven't, and some of that I think will make for certainly very interesting conversation, discussion, and hopefully taking this narrative further. While watching this episode, as I do with all documentaries, I'm really looking out for things I haven't seen before. I'm looking out for photos that haven't been provided before, whether from the discovery or the police files, footage that hasn't been seen before, and then just other little nuances that you sort of pick up through other people, especially those closest to the case, talking about it. So that's what we're going to go through here. In terms of Patreon, I haven't decided yet what I'm going to put on Patreon and what I haven't. But at this point I'm leaning towards putting the shadows on the driveway segment on Patreon. But anyway, I will confirm that closer to the time. Before we get to this episode, please subscribe, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So the star of this episode is undoubtedly Colorado Bureau of Investigation agent Tammy Lee. She's not only the star, she steals the show. It makes sense because of all the law enforcement folks on the slate in this episode. Tammy Lee is really the only one who sat in on the confession. She's the only one of this group of people on this particular episode that have had sort of a long period of one-on-one contact with Chris Watts. The others have sort of maybe encountered him here and there, maybe in court, maybe a couple of times in terms of the neighbor, but I would say that in terms of face-to-face contact, Tammy Lee beats all the other candidates hands down, including Trinastich. I must say his input into this episode is also quite fascinating. He sort of reveals quite a few fascinating things that we haven't seen before. We don't see or hear from Detective Baumhover at all, and which is kind of strange. And although Coda is referenced in the interrogation footage, we see and hear him, but it's all stuff that we've seen and heard before. We never hear from him firsthand. We do obviously from Lee, and she provides a kind of running narration right through. It's her emotions, her mission for justice for Shan'ann, Nickole, Bella and Celeste that forms the golden thread through this episode. In this in-depth analysis of the full 1 hour, 6 minute and 5 second episode of Criminal Confessions, as I've said, I'll be looking at key insights through around 5 of around about 10 to 15 minute segments. And so the first segment deals with the phone narrative. Bear in mind, as a narrator, as someone who has written 10 books on this case, it's fascinating for me to look at another narrative, how they've constructed it, how they've gone about it, what they've put in, what they've left out. And so obviously my analysis is an analysis of that narrative. Obviously it's an analysis of the Watts case, but it's also an analysis of the narrative that Oxygen have done, but also in another sense that the narrative that we're kind of getting from the story, the storytelling, the storyline that we're getting from Tammy Lee, the district attorney, and so on. So something that I found quite interesting was just the what I call the vanilla version, which is there's no spiel really, or there's no obvious spiel in this particular episode. You don't have something spun one way or the other. I would say the only real ingredient besides the vanilla is there's a certain amount of emotion, but other than that, it's pretty standard. It's pretty stock standard, and I get the impression that the people who participated with Oxygen on this participated on the understanding that they would get to I don't want to say control the narrative, but basically assert the narrative. In other words, it wouldn't be cherry picking what they said and then the makers of the documentary would then take it in whatever direction they wanted to. You get a really strong sense that the people involved are asserting the narrative, and it's the same narrative they've asserted all along, which in itself I think is quite interesting. And as we go through these segments, you'll see what they are trying to emphasize. Some of it is, maybe most of it is, are the facts related to the Watts case, but what you'll also notice just through inference and through just a study of the narrative of this episode, you'll see what they are trying to minimize or debunk, or just sort of almost cut out of the whole story. And that for me is also quite a fascinating aspect. Right, so let's continue with this episode, the phone narrative. To be honest, I wasn't going to start with it, but as I prepared for this video, I just thought it was actually quite instrumental and thus important to focus on. So let's get into it. The episode sort of opens with the familiar spiel that I think all of us know about. In the first 10 minutes of the episode, it's actually the District Attorney Michael Rourke who provides most of the voiceover narration for the familiar opening salvos of the Watts case. We have the whole thing of Nickole arriving at the door, then Officer Coonrod, then Watts returning from work, followed by the walkthrough of the house. They find the beds in disarray, but no other signs of disturbance. They find Shan'ann's medicine and purse in the house, and the car and car seats are in the garage. And yet it's Shannann's and Ceecee's health issues that don't jibe with them having gone somewhere without taking medication. It's all a little bit strange, but the thing that sort of stands out the most is the phone. And when Nicholas Atkinson discovers the phone in the couch, this is also not addressed in the documentary, but the moment that Watts sort of looks at the phone, that is addressed, and he refers to it as this is her lifeline. Now, I've obviously covered this aspect on Crime Rocket and in the books, but it's interesting to sort of go through it via Rourke's version of events. And I've stated previously that it's almost like we've forgotten about the fact that the children were dropped in crude oil. And I had one particular person on YouTube very agitated as a result of that, saying how on earth could we ever forget that? Well, it's not that people have forgotten that happened. It's the implications behind it. People have maybe not thought about, people have acknowledged that happened, and they keep sort of being emotional about it, but what about the implications? And so the same thing about Shannann's phone. Everyone's aware of the fact that the phone was in the house, and that was a big boo-boo, if you like, from Chris Watts. But I don't know to what extent people have sort of taken it both ways. The one way is the fact that Shan'ann was always on her phone. What does that say about her? What does that say about how she made a living? What does that say about her marriage? What does that say about her personality? What does that say about what kind of person she was, and all that kind of stuff? And then the flip side is, what does that say about prosecuting this crime, and what does it say about why on earth wouldn't Watts do something in terms of that phone since it was so important? And so we get this revisiting of this particular point through Rourke, who, as I say, is kind of doing the voiceover for quite a lot of the opening couple of minutes. And so one of the things he says is, Shan'ann lived her entire life through social media, through her phone. It was very unlike Shan'ann not to answer her phone, not to at least send a text. And so I think that alone raised a level of concern and fear very early on in this process. In this episode, I'm not going to spend time talking about that aspect. I think that is an area that's very glossed over, where people say, well, Shan'ann being on her phone all the time, living her life through social media, putting her family's life through social media, just being on her phone all the time, that's normal. Everybody does that. Maybe it is normal, but it's certainly not a recipe for happiness, and it's not a recipe for families to be functional. And that's definitely if you want to talk about narcissism, that is definitely the conversation to have. What I find laughable is all the people who talk about narcissism fail to make the connection between narcissism and social media. The most obvious connection with narcissism they don't make, which I think says a little bit about the schizophrenic nature of the people who are the most obsessed about this narcissism aspect. For me, the issue, having written about so many other criminals, was it's always seemed odd to me why Chris Watts didn't take kind of obvious measures to make his story more convincing using Shan'ann's phone. At the very least, he could have simply just put her phone somewhere else, in other words, not in the house, and that would have suggested that Shan'ann had left the house. Just simply by leaving the phone in the garden, or throwing it out the window on his way to work, or leaving it just anywhere else, would have really strengthened his case. So the fact that he didn't do that, for me, is very strange. In addition to that, it seems odd that he wouldn't try to contaminate the narrative by putting things into her phone, which I think he kind of did. I mean, I think that doll with the plastic thing around her, I think that was a deliberate effort to try to contaminate her phone with certain kinds of evidence, and I think it backfired because she posted it immediately on social media and sort of laughed about it. She made that not as damning or compelling as it would have been if it was just found on her phone. Do you see what I'm getting at? But the question is, why didn't Watts do more? Why didn't he take it further? And I'm not sure what the answer is to that. The one possibility is that he didn't want to do that in the first place. In other words, he didn't intend to fabricate her phone narrative. It just wasn't part of his agenda. So that's a possibility. Another possibility is he wanted to, but he couldn't. That when Shan'ann arrived back from work and he got access to her phone, suddenly he realized, this is after killing her, oh crap, I can't access her phone. I don't know how to get into it. I'm not sure if I believe that. It's possible. It's possible that he hadn't got round to it, or that he didn't have access. That's certainly something he said. But another possibility is that he simply ran out of time. He didn't have time to start that process, and he didn't expect Nickole to be at her door as quickly as she was. That's clearly something he didn't expect. And so this is what is so fascinating in the Patrick Frazee case, is that is something that he did. Frazee did take Kelsey's phone and he created a false life after death narrative. So if you want to know what it looks like, what it feels like, how effective it was against the police investigation, that's an excellent story. But then there's also problems with it. The problems were, why was Frazee's phone moving with Kelsey's phone? And the police were able to find that. And Frazee seemingly hadn't thought about that. That's another problem in the Watts case that maybe Watts was aware of that Frazee wasn't, which is, if you're going to take someone's phone anywhere, if he was going to take it to the work site, then it was going to match up perfectly with the GPS of his vehicle, and so that would implicate him. As far as I know, even an Apple phone that is turned off can theoretically leave behind that signal. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't have an Apple phone myself, but just correct me if I'm wrong in terms of that. But the fact remains, just by simply throwing the phone out the window or putting it anywhere else other than the house could have helped his case a lot. Again, he was working through the night, he was pressed for time, and so maybe it just didn't occur to him. What we do know is that it appears that he hid the phone away and didn't want the phone to be found, and that when it was found, Watts was in trouble, because it kind of proved that Shan'ann had never left the house alive. She'd not lost contact with her phone voluntarily, and so on. And now, just going back to the actual visuals, the screen grabs of the Oxygen documentary, a couple of things that I noticed that I want to share with you. One of the first was, as Coonrod is greeting Nickole and he's sort of making towards the door, you get a really great shot, a very unusual shot of the driveway with a car on it, with the trees that are sort of between the neighbor and the Watts house, and kind of the orientation in terms of that camera that is behind those trees and the driveway. But there were a couple of other things that for me I've always wanted to see, and it's very seldom that you get a decent view of the driveway, because I'm also interested in the shadows scenario and how one saw that. And so what you notice in this particular image is, first of all, where one would park if one parked in the driveway. And so you see it's kind of in the middle of that driveway on the garage on the left hand side, and as a result there's a line in the driveway kind of to the right. It's kind of a line in the concrete slab of the slanted driveway. You might not think that matters. We will get to why it does matter in the next video. But besides that, there are a couple of marks on the driveway that just caught my attention when I watched the documentary. Looking closer, they look like they're most likely just tire marks. There are two tire marks just sort of below the shadow of the roof of the house on the driveway. But it did occur to me that Nickole has arrived a couple of hours after first dropping Shan'ann off. Very little has happened to that driveway. Watts hasn't had a chance to clean it. There hasn't been any chance for weather or rain or anything to change anything. So what if Watts put a container down there and something leaked out of it or something? Not likely, but possible. And so that's what I was looking at. Are there any signs of moisture or body fluids or anything like that on the driveway? And you can't really see anything, but slightly to the right hand side, just next to the Oxy kind of logo on the bottom right, there is something lying there that's sort of looks like a reddish color, and some kind of fragment of something. I don't know what that is, but it could just be dirt, it could be stones, it could be nothing, but that is something that I noticed. One also wonders if the cadaver dogs had been able to just sniff on that apron, what they would have alerted to, if anything. one also wonders if Watts cleaned the driveway at all on that night, on Monday night, if he washed it down or something like that. We do know that on Monday night there was quite heavy rain when Nickole Atkinson was interviewed by Agent Zentner. Sorry, that's an error. It did rain Tuesday night, and that was actually when the interview was held on the Tuesday. So clearly the weather didn't have much of an impact on the scents in the driveway, but maybe Watts did clean it. We don't know. In the Ceecee case, one of the dogs did scent cadaver traces on the bumper of the car, and it turned out that Crystal Kenny, when she cleaned up the crime scene, she'd accumulated 6 full garbage bags, and then on her way to moving them to the car that she'd borrowed, she rested these 6 garbage bags against Kelsey's car, and that's precisely where the dog alerted. Now we know that the cadaver dogs showed interest in Chris Watts' truck. It's not clear whether they were allowed inside the truck, but as far as we know from the discovery, they showed interest. Just another image I want to draw your attention to. Again, it's not impossible to find. It's on the discoveries, the generic discovery released by Weld County, but we don't get too many views sort of from the edge of the Watts house to the neighbor's house. And the reason why one wants to get this sort of view is to see exactly what kind of view Watts has of the camera, and then also vice versa, what kind of view does the camera have when you're standing, in a sort of kind of orientating yourself the right way in terms of the camera and what was seen. In other words, we want to see what was seeable and just sort of get a impression of what's sort of going on with the camera. And then the documentary sort of follows the whole trip through the house. One of the first things Watts says is that all the girls' blankies are gone. Obviously what he's trying to communicate here is if their blankets are gone, they aren't here. They must have gone somewhere, and someone, by taking the blankets, has chosen for them to not be there. And if you think of the impression that's been created here, if the blankets are gone, it's kind of suggesting either that they've left very early in the morning, in other words when they would still be sleeping, so that's why the blankets are needed. You can sort of imagine if they were taken somewhere briefly, like on an outing to the mall or for a walk or something, they don't need to have their blankies with them, right? Where the blankies being gone is sort of meant to suggest that there's a more significant reason for them not being home, that they're going to be home not temporarily but an unknown longer period, and also that someone may be involved in them being gone. Not Watts, obviously. Someone who's their caretaker. He's the one that has taken their blankies, not them or she. That's the impression he's trying to create. Also, something that you see very, very briefly, and it's just unfortunate that the body cam doesn't provide a very clear view, but when you step into the girls' bedrooms, you don't get a very clear view of the beds. They're obviously not made, but you don't get a very clear impression of the beds like you do in the main bedroom. But there is the immediate going upstairs, going into their bedroom, and then you see that the beds aren't made. And what seems to be trying to say, because Watts could have made the beds himself after committing the crimes. He could have sort of made the beds and then said, no, Shan'ann and I talked when she got home from the airport, and then she just left. She'd come back from her trip and then she left. Maybe she went to North Carolina, maybe she went to a friend, whatever. But it would almost make more sense that she'd come home and then take the children. On the other hand, you could argue, well, she came home so late that the girls had to have slept between, when she came home and whatever. It's just interesting to know what sort of evidence he left behind, given that he did make the beds after that. Something else that I think was a very big moment that the officer could have taken further, as they're walking through the bathroom to Shan'ann's walk-in closet, Coonrod asks, is any of her clothes, anything like that, missing? And Watts says no. Now, if the officer had sort of pressed this issue, you've got to say, if Shan'ann's not home, then her clothes, some of her clothes have to be missing. And what I mean is, she has to be, if she's missing, then what she's wearing has to be what is missing in terms of her clothing, right? And so what was missing what was that shirt. And if Coonrod had just followed that simple line of questioning, he could have said, well, okay, so what was the shirt she was wearing and where is that shirt? And they could have immediately seized that shirt and tested it and so on. Was the shirt washed? So does that mean Shan'ann got home, took off her shirt, put it in the washing, but then why didn't she take a shower? And all that kind of thing. Obviously, it's easy to play Monday morning quarterback, and obviously the officer had no real reason then to suspect things and to question everything at that kind of micro aggressive level. But I'm just saying, if he had, you could have had a breakthrough there. And so how Watts answers it is just nah. He just says nah, nothing's missing. If Watts did change Shan'ann's shirt, he would have known exactly what was missing, what she was wearing, and he did. And so he's quite dismissive of the question, just has his back turned to the officer and just like, nah. Now you can imagine in a genuine situation where someone is genuinely missing, and Watts wasn't involved, and he was concerned, he would be activated by this question. Let me see what is missing. That's a really good question. Let me check. And instead he just sort of shows the extent of Shan'ann's wardrobe and basically says, well, look, everything's here. But it's a very dismissive response. The officer doesn't push him. It's almost as if he's saying, well, look, how would I know what's missing? But of course he did know what was missing. And that then brings us to the that first moment where Watts provides a version to Officer Coonrod. Coonrod asks, did she move out? And Watts had said something along the lines of, she sent him a message saying that she was going to take the kids somewhere. And then Coonrod said, well, did she say she was going to move out? And then Watts, this is his first version of the events, and he says, not moving out, I mean, last time I talked to her was this morning. And he says she was going to take the kids, and that's where she was going to be. And then I've texted her today, I've never heard anything. But the car's here, the car seats are here, and the people that I know, and he doesn't really answer that question, and then he provides a little path to send law enforcement down, unless somebody came and picked her up. And that's kind of what he's getting at, is that Shan'ann left with somebody else and just dropped everything and left it. She was so upset that she just left everything. And for Watts that makes complete sense, but for somebody else it doesn't. And then her phone is discovered, and Nickole reacts and she's very worried. But you should look at Nicholas Atkinson's face. He has his arms folded, he is kind of glaring at Chris Watts. If looks could kill, he could maybe bore a hole right through Watts' skull. He's he's very worried. You can see it. He's very suspicious, and the look on Watts' face also looks like, I won't say panic, but he looks stressed. He looks, there's a kind of a redness to his face and a tautness to his face where he doesn't look relaxed at all. And think of the irony of someone saying this is her lifeline when Watts destroyed that lifeline. Watts killed his wife and now is holding on to her lifeline. Couldn't that be something that would give him a lifeline? And so Officer Coonrod, who is quite perceptive, asks Watts, what was going on? Did you guys have any issues, marital issues? And Watts stutters. It's kind of a dark, gloomy scenario that they're in, and he says, well, we're going through a separation. Coonrod asks in a conversational way, you guys filed yet or anything, or just talking? And Watts says, no, we were gonna have to sell the house and go through a separation. And look at his words there. Not we were gonna sell the house. We were gonna have to sell the house. It's almost as if what he provides there are the priorities he has for what's going on. It's not that they needed to separate and then they had to sell the house. It's we were going to have to sell the house and go through a separation. And so that, to me, reveals his priorities in terms of the money. The money was the big problem, and in terms of they had to sell the house. The separation was almost like a byproduct of the really, really bad financial situation they were in. And I don't want to take that further than that. But I guess something else that I noticed just in this visual is, do you notice the windows to the right? They don't have any blinds on them, and there are neighbors down the road that are also double story that could theoretically see through those windows. I don't mean see details, but they could see if lights were on. They could see if there were movements, if they were shouting or something, that they might be able to see that kind of thing. There's potentially line of sight from a neighbor through that window onto that loft area. And so that wouldn't be an ideal place to have a altercation. If there was someone carrying a cell phone in the dark, and the cell phone starts jumping around during an assault, that might also be seen through that open window. You may not think that that's very significant, but if you want to commit a murder, you are very aware of who is watching and what might be seen, because one witness can sink your case. And so in terms of that, you want to execute the murder in a place where there's not going to be sound easily leaving from that part of the house, and also not easily seen by people on other sides of the house. And so I thought the archival footage that they showed from Denver 7, just of the house from an aerial view, that's something else that we haven't really gotten to see very often in sort of very clear detail. But through this aerial view, you get to see the orientation of the Watts home in terms of the neighboring houses and also the houses coming down Steeplecross Drive. You just see how very closely packed the houses are to one another, and how the windows of houses that are next to the Watts home can sort of line up with windows at the same height. If you live in a complex, you know that you tend to look horizontally through your window, and so it would be really obvious very easy and very natural just to look into the windows of the Watts home, especially if if the lights are on at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Someone criticized me on YouTube recently saying there aren't deep cerebral reasons for why Watts did what he did, and you just wasting everyone's time by going into that area. And I think you can really simplify this case that it was a guy who wanted to have an affair, and so he killed his family. And if that satisfies you, then that's fine. But then move on to other cases. I mean, if the Watts case is so simple and so shallow, then that's the bottom line of it. But then move on. I mean, if it's so simple, then that's the end of the story. For me, it's not. For me, there's a lot of analogy to other families, to the lot we have in life in terms of just so many different things like debt, things like social media, things like attitudes to one another, things like, for me, one of the things that bothers me the most is how the sexes treat one another, and they think they know the opposite sex very, very well. So I think a lot of, if you look at how women treat Shan'ann and how those same women treat Chris Watts, and then they think that's reality. They think that is the reality. What they think of Shan'ann and Chris Watts, that's reality. And then there are fewer people who have a different attitude to both of them. They have a different attitude to Shan'ann, and they have a different attitude to Chris Watts. What's I think lacking a little bit in the Chris Watts commentary is that there aren't that many men talking about Chris Watts. They don't talk, they're not there to say what he may have seen in Nickole Kessinger. They may not have, in other words, Shan'ann's social media is addressed and acknowledged, and her side of the story is emphasized, and it should be in terms of her being the victim and so on. But just in terms of reality, knowing why this case happened, Shan'ann kind of gets the lion's share of airtime and her feelings and all that kind of thing. And obviously her feelings need to be acknowledged, but for me the question is, are they being acknowledged accurately? Is the balance fair? Is it, what is the reality in terms of the dynamic? And having that conversation, people say, no, now you are being on Chris Watts' side, or now you are blaming the victim. It's not that. It is simply saying, what was the nature of their relationship? And how did this lead to murder? If it did, how did these dynamics play out? And it's the same thing one does in all the other murders. It's the same thing court cases are focused with. What is the motive? No one would enter a courtroom and say, how dare you deal with the psychology of this person? I think you're just blaming the victim. You need, it's part of trying to understand how these cases work. And so when I look at this image of this really glum grey picture, everything in it is grey, and there's a little light in the edge of it. It's almost like the light of this other life beckoning to Chris Watts, but there's a dark doorway behind him, and Chris Watts is looking down at his phone. He's got glasses on the top of his head, but he's also dressed in grey, and he's just chuckled to the police officer standing in front of him. He's got a stairway stinking down to the side, and the police officer just asked him, are you guys having a civil separation? And he kind of interrupts when Watts tries to answer, and Watts is kind of stuttering. And he interrupts him and he says, civil for the most part, and Watts laughs and he says, civil, yeah. And we can see exactly why Watts did laugh. We can see why he was relieved to be interrupted at that point, because the whole reason the murder happened was because they weren't going to have a civil separation. They weren't having a civil separation at that time anyway. It was becoming ugly, right? And Watts didn't want it to get uglier, and so he laughs about it being civil, and it's kind of a self-deprecating laugh. And I think this says a hell of a lot about Chris Watts. And he then looks down at his phone, and you kind of get a sense of depression there from Watts. You get a sense of heaviness. And when I was watching this episode, through this moment, I couldn't help thinking, can you imagine what this house must feel like? Where the house is the prop in Thrive, and the house is this big success story and how wonderful the Watts family is, and it's this picture postcard life, right? But it's a bit different for Watts. For Watts, the house is like a false narrative. The house is what's weighing on him. The house is causing them to drown in debt. They can't afford the house, and so this thing that everyone else sees as the wonderful Watts family, for him is this horrible burden that he's almost got to carry alone. Shan'ann doesn't seem to acknowledge it, but guess who's paying the mortgage? Guess who on whose name is the mortgage? Guess whose salary check disappears to pay for all of this stuff? And so I think for Watts, the house, that even when he walks around in it, is this ball and chain. To everybody else, the house is this fairy tale, but to him it's a nightmare. The house, literally the walls and the roof and the size of it, and he doesn't want to be in the house anymore. He doesn't want to be in his family anymore. It's just become one huge burden, and Kessinger has provided an exit to that, where he can live somewhere else with someone else in a different life, and that's literally what he wants. He wants a different life. He doesn't want the house. He doesn't want to be in the house, and I think that's quite a useful thing to think about. And then we see also Watts looking down at his phone, and if we go into the phone narrative, there's a couple of messages. There's one at 12:21 where Watts tells Josh, this is another version of what he's saying happened to Shan'ann. He says, I just talked to Nikki. Shan'ann went to a friend's house with the kids today. I haven't heard from her since. I'll keep you updated. And so it's just a simple thing that he doesn't say that they argued, but simply that Shan'ann just left with the kids, and he hasn't heard from her. Or maybe he hasn't heard from her because she left her phone at home and she didn't want to talk to him or whatever. But that's his version. Then he gives another version much later in the day, and this is on Discovery page 2127, from the phone data review. Interestingly enough, the phone data review isn't really referred to at all in the documentary, but there Burke asks Watts if Shan'ann was awake when he left for work, and Watts answers, I talked to her early this morning between 4 and 5. I think she went back to sleep afterwards. She was still here when I left, kids still sleeping. So what he's saying in that message late in the day is that everyone was asleep, everyone was in bed when he left. And can you get a more harmless explanation than that? Than that they were all in bed and then he left. He had nothing to do with their crimes. And it's for this reason that all the beds need to be not made. It's to prove that they were in bed. That's kind of his alibi. The beds are his alibi. And why would Watts commit the crimes in his alibi? Why would Watts commit the crimes in any of the bedrooms? Because that would then disprove him not being there. In other words, when he left, they were in their beds. So why would he put himself in their beds and in their bedrooms? The thing that gives a bit of substance to the idea that Watts meant to have a staged narrative also on Shan'ann's phone is that at 0740, a little bit more than 2 hours after Watts left the driveway, obviously at this point all the bodies have been disposed of, he sent a staged message from the well side to Shan'ann's phone saying, if you take the kids somewhere, please let me know where they're at. Watts is doing this for plausible deniability. He's doing it because he's expecting someone at some point to look at his phone, or someone at some point to look at Shan'ann's phone. And so through this you can see that he anticipates someone is going to be looking at his phone, and so he is using the phone as a way to pretend that Shan'ann is still alive, just as Patrick Frazee did. This continues at 0825, so 45 minutes later, Watts sends another message. Well, he just makes a staged call to Shan'ann's phone, and what he's trying to do here is just reinforce the sense that he doesn't know where she is. He doesn't know that she's died. He's calling her, and all that kind of thing. But what to me is really interesting is this last one. at 14:11, because at 14:11 he sends a staged message, "Where are you?" And at 14:11, I believe Watts was either he just arrived at the front door, right, finding Nickole and Officer Coonrod at the house, or it was just after they'd entered. I know this is something that I've addressed previously. I can't quite remember what we established, because you can check with the time of the body cam exactly when Watts entered the residence. But why I think it's interesting is if you look at 14:14, so 3 minutes after Watts sent this message, Shan'ann started receiving all sorts of messages on her phone, and what that indicates is either the Wi-Fi was activated very shortly after that, or after Watts sent that text, or Shanann's phone was turned on, or both. So that for me is really interesting. The fact that Shanann's phone was turned off, if it was turned off, may mean that the phone did go some journey. I don't know if it went with him in the work truck. I don't think so, but I do think the phone may have gone from the garage in Shanann's car upstairs to the loft couch. And then at about 12 minutes into the criminal confessions episode, the camera I guess the camera is oriented towards the Watts home, the garage, the apron, and it's sort of looking straight towards the Watts home, and then it pans to the left to the neighbor, and this is what then this is the beginning of the second segment, which deals with Dranastich, which deals with the surveillance footage, which deals with the Watts taking the narrative essentially from the home to Survey 319. And this is when we should ask the question, what about the shadows? And that is something I will deal with in the next episode in this series. Thank you for listening.